Part 3. The Secret of the Island. Chapter 10. Of the convicts. The dangers which menaced Granite House. The ruins with which the plateau was covered. The colonists thought no longer. Herbert's critical state outweighed all other considerations. Would the removal prove fatal to him by causing some internal injury? The reporter could not affirm it, but he and his companions almost despaired of the result. The cart was brought to the bend of the river. There some branches, disposed as a liner, received the mattress on which lay the unconscious Herbert. 10 minutes after, Cyrus Harding, Spilett, and Pencroft were at the foot of the cliff, leaving Neb to take the cart onto the plateau of Prospect Heights. The lift was put in motion, and Herbert was soon stretched on his bed in Granite House. What cares were lavished on him to bring him back to life? He smiled for a moment on finding himself in his room, but could scarcely even murmur a few words, so great was his weakness. Gideon Spilett examined his wounds. He feared to find them reopened, having been imperfectly healed. There was nothing of the sort. From whence, then, came this prostration? Why was Herbert so much worse? The lad then fell into a kind of feverish sleep, and the reporter and Pencroft remained near the bed. During this time, Harding told Neb all that had happened at the corral, and Neb recounted to his master the events of which the plateau had just been the theatre. It was only during the preceding night that the convicts had appeared on the edge of the forest, at the approaches to Creek Glycerine. Neb, who was watching near the poultry yard, had not hesitated to fire at one of the pirates, who was about to cross the stream. But in the darkness he could not tell whether the man had been hit or not. At any rate, it was not enough to frighten away the band, and Neb had only just time to get up to Granite House, where at least he was in safety. But what was he to do there? How prevent the devastations with which the convicts threatened the plateau? Had Neb any means by which to warn his master? And, besides, in what situation were the inhabitants of the corral themselves? Cyrus Harding and his companions had left on the 11th of November, and it was now the 29th. It was, therefore, 19 days since Neb had had other news than that brought by Top. Disastrous news. Ayrton disappeared. Herbert severely wounded. The engineer, reporter, and sailor, as it were, imprisoned in the corral. What was he to do? Asked poor Neb. Personally he had nothing to fear, for the convicts could not reach him in Granite House. But the buildings, the plantations, all their arrangements at the mercy of the pirates. Would it not be best to let Cyrus Harding judge of what he ought to do, and to warn him, at least, of the danger which threatened him? Neb then thought of employing Jup, and confiding a note to him. He knew the orang's great intelligence, which had been often put to the proof. Jup understood the word corral, which had been frequently pronounced before him, and it may be remembered, too, that he had often driven the cart thither in company with Pencroft. Day had not yet dawned. The active orang would know how to pass unperceived through the woods, of which the convicts, besides, would think he was a native. Neb did not hesitate. He wrote the note. He tied it to Jup's neck. He brought the ape to the door of Granite House, from which he let down a long cord to the ground. Then, several times he repeated these words: Jup, Jup, corral, corral. The creature understood, seized the cord, glided rapidly down the beach, and disappeared in the darkness without the convicts' attention having been in the least excited. You did well, Neb, said Harding, but perhaps in not warning us you would have done still better. And, in speaking thus, Cyrus Harding thought of Herbert, whose recovery the removal had so seriously checked. Neb ended his account. The convicts had not appeared at all on the beach. Not knowing the number of the island's inhabitants, they might suppose that Granite House was defended by a large party. They must have remembered that, during the attack by the brig, numerous shot had been fired both from their lower and upper rocks, and no doubt they did not wish to expose themselves. But the plateau of Prospect Heights was open to them, and not covered by the fire of Granite House. They gave themselves up, therefore, to their instinct of destruction, plundering, burning, devastating everything, and only retiring half an hour before the arrival of the colonists, whom they believed still confined in the corral. On their retreat, Neb hurried out. He climbed the plateau at the risk of being perceived and fired at, tried to extinguish the fire which was consuming the buildings of the poultry yard, and had struggled, though in vain, against it until the cart appeared at the edge of the wood. Such had been these serious events. The presence of the convicts constituted a permanent source of danger to the settlers in Lincoln Island, until then so happy, and who might now expect still greater misfortunes. Spilett remained in Granite House with Herbert and Pencroft, while Cyrus Harding, accompanied by Neb, proceeded to judge for himself of the extent of the disaster. It was fortunate that the convicts had not advanced to the foot of Granite House. The workshop at the Chimneys would in that case not have escaped destruction. But after all, this evil would have been more easily reparable than the ruins accumulated on the plateau of Prospect Heights. Harding and Neb proceeded towards the Mercy, and ascended its left bank, without meeting with any trace of the convicts, nor on the other side of the river, in the depths of the wood, could they perceive any suspicious indications. Besides, it might be supposed that in all probability either the convicts knew of the return of the settlers to Granite House, by having seen them pass on the road from the corral, or, after the devastation of the plateau, they had penetrated into Jacamar Wood, following the course of the Mercy, and were thus ignorant of their return. In the former case, they must have returned towards the corral, now without defenders, and which contained valuable stores. In the latter, they must have regained their encampment, and would wait on opportunity to recommence the attack. It was, therefore, possible to prevent them, but any enterprise to clear the island was now rendered difficult by reason of Herbert's condition. Indeed, their whole force would have been barely sufficient to cope with the convicts, and just now no one could leave Granite House. The engineer and Neb arrived on the plateau. Desolation reigned everywhere. The fields had been trampled over. The ears of wheat, which were nearly full grown, lay on the ground. The other plantations had not suffered less. The kitchen garden was destroyed. Happily, Granite House possessed a store of seed which would enable them to repair these misfortunes. As to the wall and buildings of the poultry yard and the owner's stable, the fire had destroyed all. A few terrified creatures roamed over the plateau. The birds, which during the fire had taken refuge on the waters of the lake, had already returned to their accustomed spot, and were dabbling on the banks. Everything would have to be reconstructed. Cyrus Harding's face, which was paler than usual, expressed an internal anger which he commanded with difficulty, but he did not utter a word. Once more he looked at his devastated fields, and at the smoke which still rose from the ruins. Then he returned to Granite House. The following days were the saddest of any that the colonists had passed on the island. Herbert's weakness visibly increased. It appeared that a more serious malady, the consequence of the profound physiological disturbance he had gone through, threatened to declare itself, and Gideon Spilett feared such an aggravation of his condition that he would be powerless to fight against it. In fact, Herbert remained in an almost continuous state of drowsiness, and symptoms of delirium began to manifest themselves. Refreshing drinks were the only remedies at the colonists' disposal. The fever was not as yet very high, but it soon appeared that it would probably recur at regular intervals. Gideon Spilett first recognized this on the 6th of December. The poor boy, whose fingers, nose, and ears had become extremely pale, was at first seized with slight shiverings, horripilations, and tremblings. His pulse was weak and irregular, his skin dry, his thirst intense. To this soon succeeded a hot fit. His face became flushed, his skin reddened, his pulse quick. Then a profuse perspiration broke out, after which the fever seemed to diminish. The attack had lasted nearly 5 hours. Gideon Spilett had not left Herbert, who, it was only too certain, was now seized by an intermittent fever, and this fever must be cured at any cost, before it should assume a more serious aspect. And in order to cure it, said Spilett to Cyrus Harding, we need a febrifuge. A febrifuge, answered the engineer. We have neither Peruvian bark, nor sulfate of quinine. No, said Gideon Spilett, but there are willows on the border of the lake, and the bark of the willow might, perhaps, prove to be a substitute for quinine. Let us try it without losing a moment, replied Cyrus Harding. The bark of the willow has, indeed, been justly considered as a succedaneum for Peruvian bark, as has also that of the horse chestnut tree, the leaf of the holly, the snake root, etc. It was evidently necessary to make trial of this substance, although not so valuable as Peruvian bark, and to employ it in its natural state, since they had no means for extracting its essence. Cyrus Harding went himself to cut from the trunk of a species of black willow a few pieces of bark. He brought them back to Granite House, and reduced them to a powder, which was administered that same evening to Herbert. The night passed without any important change. Herbert was somewhat delirious, but the fever did not reappear in the night, and did not return either during the following day. Pencroft again began to hope. Gideon Spilett said nothing. It might be that the fever was not quotidian, but tertian, and that it would return next day. Therefore, he awaited the next day with the greatest anxiety. It might have been remarked besides that during this period Herbert remained utterly prostrate, his head weak and giddy. Another symptom alarmed the reporter to the highest degree. Herbert's liver became congested, and soon a more intense delirium showed that his brain was also affected. Gideon Spilett was overwhelmed by this new complication. He took the engineer aside. "It is a malignant fever," said he. "A malignant fever," cried Harding. "You are mistaken, Spilett. A malignant fever does not declare itself spontaneously. Its germ must previously have existed." "I am not mistaken," replied the reporter. "Herbert no doubt contracted the germ of this fever in the marshes of the island. He has already had one attack. Should a second come on, and should we not be able to prevent a third, he is lost. But the willow bark, that is insufficient," answered the reporter. "And the third attack of a malignant fever, which is not arrested by means of quinine, is always fatal." Fortunately, Pencroft heard nothing of this conversation, or he would have gone mad. It may be imagined what anxiety the engineer and the reporter suffered. during the day of the 7th of December and the following night. Towards the middle of the day, the second attack came on. The crisis was terrible. Herbert felt himself sinking. He stretched his arms towards Cyrus Harding, towards Spilett, towards Pencroft. He was so young to die. The scene was heart-rending. They were obliged to send Pencroft away. The fit lasted 5 hours. It was evident that Herbert could not survive a third. The night was frightful. In his delirium, Herbert uttered words which went to the hearts of his companions. He struggled with the convicts. He called to Ayrton. He poured forth entreaties to that mysterious being, that powerful unknown protector, whose image was stamped upon his mind. Then he again fell into a deep exhaustion which completely prostrated him. Several times Gideon Spilett thought that the poor boy was dead. The next day, the 8th of December, was but a succession of the fainting fits. Herbert's thin hands clutched the sheets. They had administered further doses of pounded bark, but the reporter expected no result from it. "If before tomorrow morning we have not given him a more energetic febrifuge," said the reporter, "Herbert will be dead." Night arrived. The last night. It was too much to be feared. Of the good, brave, intelligent boy, so far in advance of his years, and who was loved by all as their own child, the only remedy which existed against this terrible malignant fever, the only specific which could overcome it, was not to be found in Lincoln Island. During the night of the 8th of December, Herbert was seized by a more violent delirium. His liver was fearfully congested, his brain affected, and already it was impossible for him to recognize anyone. Would he live until the next day? Until that third attack which must infallibly carry him off? It was not probable. His strength was exhausted, and in the intervals of fever he lay as one dead. Towards 3 o'clock in the morning, Herbert uttered a piercing cry. He seemed to be torn by a supreme convulsion. Neb, who was near him, terrified, ran into the next room where his companions were watching. Top, at that moment, barked in a strange manner. All rushed in immediately and managed to restrain the dying boy, who was endeavoring to throw himself out of his bed, while Spilett, taking his arm, felt his pulse gradually quicken. It was 5 in the morning. The rays of the rising sun began to shine in at the windows of Granite House. It promised to be a fine day, and this day was to be poor Herbert's last. A ray glanced on the table placed near the bed. Suddenly Pencroft, uttering a cry, pointed to the table. On it lay a little oblong box, of which the cover bore these words: "Sulphate of quinine."